Alright guys, welcome back to James Pigeon, and today I'm going to be doing the trend of answering the most Googled questions about something, where it's basically this thing that they're doing online where they will Google an opening phrase, like why, did, how, is, about a thing, usually a celebrity, and then the celebrity themselves that they've got to be in this video will answer the questions and explain them. Well, I have less than 500 subscribers, so I don't think there's enough Google questions about James Pigeon for me to do a video like that. But something I do know quite a lot about, and I hope I can be a resource about, is colonial North America. Basically, North America broadly from the years 1600 to 1800. More specifically, I'd say like 1607 to 1867. I'll say the settlement of Jamestown to the Confederation of Canada is really where the absolute bulk of my historical knowledge is. So I'm going to do most Googled questions about colonial America. So just get into it. Was colonial America democratic? I would say it broadly depends on which colony you're talking about, because colonial America, I'm pretty sure this is probably referring to the American 13 colonies, was, as the name implies, 13 different colonies. So there, really was a lot of differences between them of how democratic they were. Some were very democratic, like New England, which had town councils with a direct democracy system that is still used in some places in like rural Vermont, where everyone in the town will gather in the town hall and vote by show of hands or something, or some like weird tradition like ringing a bell or something, something like that. Some obscure, dated 17th century, quaint form of small town New England life that they will still use to decide things like a school board budget or blue laws or something back in the day. And then Virginia was kind of democratic. They had something called the House of Burgesses, but that was more of really just an implement of the aristocracy. I'm pretty sure it was founded in the 1600s, and I'm pretty sure by the mid-1700s, literally every single member of the House of Burgesses was from one of like 5 families or something, and they were all cousins. They made jokes about how they were all cousins. It was pretty unabashedly just an instrument of the aristocracy, so I don't know how democratic you would call that. I mean, Burgesses comes from burger, which is same root as bourgeoisie. It means like a rich person, wealthy middle-class person, aristocratic. So it really depends. And then obviously in the Deep South, which was founded later by immigrants from Barbados, it was less democratic. And then in the Appalachian, there was not much organized government at all. And then in the middle colonies, New York was very autocratic, actually. New York was ruled by these kind of like comically aristocratic Dutch feudal lords called patroons that ruled these massive areas of land along the Hudson River, and basically were trying to have like serfdoms. And then it was a very autocratic society up until kind of as a New Yorker, kind of embarrassingly late. And I don't know enough about Pennsylvania and New Jersey and stuff to say, but okay, that's the first question. All right, the second thing, was colonial America a successful society? I would say that colonial America should broadly be considered a successful society, just in the Darwinistic sense that in less than a little bit less than 200 years, a little more than 150 years, it went from literally having 0 people to having over 2.5 million people and becoming its own country. And colonial America set the stage for the United States of America, which became the most powerful, famous country in world history up to this point. So I would say colonial America was a broadly successful society. It was broadly wealthy. There was more equality, at least in certain parts, definitely not in like the South or whatever, but the average person did own some land after indentured servitude ended. It was a lot more egalitarian than England, which is why a lot of people moved here, as opposed to like New France, which was a lot less egalitarian than France, so no one came there. So I would say colonial America was broadly a very successful entrepreneurial and independent-minded society, to the end that when they unified and became their own country, it was a very successful country. Okay, when was colonial America? So colonial America was basically, I guess you could say, from the founding of Virginia in 1607 to the American Revolution in 1775. So I guess you could say 1607 to 1775. That's pretty clear cut. If you're saying America as a whole, I guess you could say 1492 to like present, very pedantically and technically, because there are still some European colonies like French Guiana and Saint Martin, I guess. Most of these places are basically independent. I mean, French Guiana is just like a state of France, so it's more like their Alaska or Hawaii. And then a lot of the Caribbean islands are basically independent. So I guess in a very pedantic sense, you could say that they're still colonial parts of North America, but I'd say really it ended in the 1860s when Britain lost like major control over Canada because it became its own country. And it was basically 3 independent countries, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, stretching from sea to sea. Okay, what was colonial America like? Well, that is obviously an extremely broad question. I mean, for one, what do you mean was like? Like, what was life like for the average person? Well, it varied from colony to colony. In New England, it was basically a cultural theocracy. Some ways a governmental theocracy, although they did have separation of church and state, at least officially. In theory, very tightly controlled, intolerant society, but also very well-educated, wealthy, successful society, but really just a place of extreme conformity. I mean, obviously, most people were a farmer, but I mean, if you lived in one of the big cities, like Boston or Philadelphia or New York, I guess you could be a merchant, business owner of some sort, but I mean, most people were farmers, basically like everyone in the world back then. Middle states, you were probably a rural farmer. Your life's not going to be that different, except your town might be a lot more religiously diverse, I guess, and I guess more tolerant. South, if you're poor, you're going to be really poor, and if you're rich, you're really rich. And then deep south, you're either like an aristocratic plantation lord, or you're just a slave that is not treated as human at all. Right. And not answering repeats. Who was colonial America's foremost theologian? I mean, it's pretty subjective, but I would say that the Puritan preacher, Jonathan Edwards, would probably be the most foremost theologian. direct ancestor of Aaron Burr. He was a deeply fiery and passionate Puritan preacher. I've listened to 2 of his sermons. Very interesting perspective, very harsh brand of Christianity, very condemning of sin and stuff. It apparently had brought a lot of people to tears when he preached it. At least one person killed themselves. So it had very strong effects. Part of a movement in the 1730s called the First Great Awakening, where basically religious revival and Christianity was sweeping the colonies and people were getting a lot more passionate. I mean, as the title First Great Awakening implies, it was one of many great awakenings. And so I would say answer to that question is, in my opinion, Jonathan Edwards. Maybe you can make a case for Cotton Mather or some Methodist guy, but I think Jonathan Edwards is definitely going to be the most famous. His sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, is very famous, and you will probably have to analyze it at some point in high school or college for an American history or religious studies class. All right, let's go to the next set of questions. All right, here's the next set of questions. What was colonial America? All right, what was colonial America? Colonial America was the period where the American culture existed, but it was not yet the United States. It was various British colonies. What was colonial America like? Answered that. What was colonial America's largest city? So, I mean, obviously this is a very large span of time. This is over 150 years, but generally it was between Philadelphia and Boston, and then New York City surpassed in 1790 and has been the biggest ever since. But in the colonial period, it was either Boston or Philadelphia were really the highlights. Okay, what was British colonial America? So, British colonial America, distinguished from the North American claims of France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Spain, was, I guess you could say, the 13 American colonies there were more colonies. There were mergers and stuff. But by the time of the Revolution, it was 13, which were Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. But there were other colonies that are forgotten, like East Jersey, West Jersey, which were obviously merged into New Jersey. Saybrook, New Haven were merged into Connecticut. Plymouth was merged into Massachusetts. There were some failed colonies, Roanoke and Popham. Roanoke in North Carolina, Popham in Maine, both British colonies that failed. Then, of course, you had the colonies that were north of the 13 colonies that had usually a lower population and a much more dependent economy, and they stayed loyal to Britain during the Revolution. Those being what we would call Canada, newly conquered from the French in the 1700s. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, somewhere a bit earlier, you had, Newfoundland, which really small population. They did not join Canada until the 40s. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, the Acadian colonies, which were heavily settled by New Englanders, actually. Quebec, or as they called it, Lower Canada, or maybe Upper Canada, whatever. There was Lower and Upper Canada. One was Quebec, one was Ontario. I don't remember which, to be honest. And then there was Rupert's Land, Prince Rupert's Land, which was the private domain of the Hudson's Bay Company, very lightly populated, and I guess, they would just hunt for furs and sell them to the Europeans to make hats and whatever. And then there was the Floridas, East and West Florida, acquired from the Spanish after war, and then given back to the Spanish later, so they didn't have them for that long. And then there, I guess, if we're going further south, there was Belize or British Honduras, the Mosquito Coast, and then various Caribbean islands. But yeah, that was really British North America. Okay. What era was colonial America? I guess I already said this. I mean, it lasted from, I don't know what you would describe as an era. Lasted from basically 1610 around to like colonial America. If we're talking about the United States, it has very easy start and end dates, 1607, 1776. But I don't know what era you would count that as. What religion was colonial America? Christian. I'll just say that, but no, different. Each colony had basically its own major religion. Massachusetts was founded by the Puritans, who were, their religion is now called Congregationalist. The denomination survives in some sense as the UCC, United Church of Christ, although they're considered the most progressive denomination, which is kind of funny historically, because the Congregationalists, the Puritans, were basically some of the most conservative Protestants, very hardcore Calvinists, basically, and very intolerant, and they were trying to make like a perfect society. And then Plymouth was the Pilgrims, which were basically a more extreme sect. And then Connecticut was, basically New England was these. But Rhode Island was Baptist. They were founded. Rhode Island is interesting because they had complete religious freedom, one of the first places in the world to do that. And Rhode Island was founded by people who got, I think Roger Williams was his name, and there was a woman who was like Anne Hutchinson or something. I might be mixing up these very generic English 1700s names, but they were exiled to Rhode Island for not fitting with the Calvinist orthodoxy, and Rhode Island got a pretty large Baptist influence. Brown University is Baptist founded. New York, I guess because it used to be a Dutch colony, you could say Dutch Reformed. The now exists in a few denominations: Reformed Church of America, Reformed Christian Church, North America. But I mean, I guess you could say Dutch Reformed, and then when the English took it, I guess you could say Anglican, which is now Episcopalian, but it's the same religion. New Jersey, I don't know, it's basically a mix of stuff. And then Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers, which is this very heterodox Christian sect that is from England and still exists, with a low population that believed in a lot of things that other denominations found strange, such as not practicing any physical sacraments, not having any structured worship. They just kind of sat in a room and said stuff when they felt like they were being moved to speak. And they were extreme pacifists. They refused to swear oaths, which made them very annoying to government workers and the courts and stuff. So they were really oppressed and very badly by everyone, and they decided to make Pennsylvania, where not just Quakerism, but every religion was tolerated. Really everyone was tolerated, like, had pretty much the best treatment of Indians by far. So, yeah, and then Maryland was founded to be a haven for English Catholics, but it was pretty quickly taken over by Protestants, Calvinists, immigrants from New England. And then, Virginia, Anglican, the rest of the South, pretty solidly Anglican. All right, I'll speed it up a bit. So, did colonial Americans have British accents? Well, yeah, at the time, their accent was pretty similar to the accent of Britain, just by the fact that not that much time had passed. A lot of them were just literally immigrants from England, but there were some dialectal differences. There were some unique American words, for example, that were in phrases. I can't think of any right now, but there was some unique vocabulary that came from Native American languages, which is pretty interesting. I mean, yeah, basically just dialect stuff. The accent hadn't really divulged that much. I mean, they sounded a lot more like current Americans than current British people. Like, I say that the general American accent is more similar to colonial America. Like, the English spoken by a guy in Virginia now is, I would say, more similar to the English spoken by a guy in Virginia in 1700 than a guy in London versus a guy in London 1700. I just think the American English has changed less. So it's interesting. I mean, there's like a myth that modern American English is like exactly the same as it used to be, and then so we're like the original, and the British people like invented the British accent, which is not true. It was different from both of the modern ones, but I do think linguistically that American English has just changed less for whatever reason. Maybe that's a colonial remnant. I don't know why, but yeah, we've kind of preserved some more stuff. Okay, so what did colonial Americans eat? It's very interesting. There's a YouTube channel called Townsend's that he's basically a guy who professionally LARPs as like a 1700s American frontiersman, and he has a lot of cooking videos that show what the American diet was like in the 1700s, the second half of the colonial era. So that's, I guess, a recommendation, but the food was, pretty plain, just by the nature that most Americans were not really that rich, and even the richest Americans could not really afford to import a bunch of fancy spices because, I mean, it was already super expensive to import that to Europe, but then you're importing it all the way across the Atlantic. I guess it was a lot more game-based than back in England. I mean, they'd kind of make like English recipes, but with American meats, it was a lot more based on there was a lot more wild game and foraging involved, just because most people lived relatively close to the wilderness, unless you lived in like a super developed area, like the Boston area. But even then, it was really not that far from like the woods. There was a overhunting problem, like in colonial Massachusetts. There was they were almost hunted deer to extinction, and they had to make game wardens called informers of deer that would basically they took it very seriously. If an informer of deer failed to stop someone from illegally killing a deer, they would be punished, as well as the guy who killed the deer for failing to do their duty. So there was a lot of hunting. There was some Native American influence into the food. Actually, I don't know, a lot in terms of ingredients, like corn. Corn is a very American crop in terms of the Americas. It is from the Americas. It was domesticated by ancient Native Americans, and it has always been, the main grain over here. I mean, corn literally used to just mean grain. Like in British English, corn just means like a grain. And because corn, or maize as the British say, is like the default grain in this continent, that's why we call it corn. So I guess, there was corn, turkeys, cod. Cod was a big deal in New England. There were very plentiful cod fisheries. Lobster was not that, I don't think it was a massive part of the diet until a bit later, even though it's very plentiful. What did colonial America look like? In terms of borders, or in terms of like the setting? I guess setting, it was small towns, few, like literally like 3 or 4 cities by modern standards, and mostly small towns, country roads, farms, forest, pretty underdeveloped. How did colonial Americans speak? Well, they had the standard kind of English accent at the time, but that's closer to American English. There's another YouTuber named Simon Roper who does pretty good historical accent breakdowns, and I think he has one about colonial America. Now we have the next set of questions, which is why did colonial Americans wear wigs? Well, I think it wasn't a uniquely American thing. That was just the style of what upper-class Europeans did at the time, so I guess you could say they were just copying their counterparts. I mean, trying to seem upper-class. There was kind of an anxiety that you were, like, lower than the English nobles if you're, like, an American noble, so a lot of American nobles were, like, in the South and stuff, were like very ostentatiously, like comically aristocratic, to the point that it'd be probably considered kind of out of fashion and garish to an actual English aristocrat. They were really playing it up to like a stereotypical degree. Why did colonial America need a government? Colonial Americans organized their own governments in the different colonies because with 16 and 1700s technology, England could not realistically govern these people who lived very far away, like 3 months by mail if you're trying to send stuff both ways. So they created their own governments, and then I guess you could say the reason they needed a united government was to first fight the French together and then fight the British together. And along the way, the military alliance became a political alliance, confederation into a federation, and one big old USA. Except the far northern colonies didn't agree, and they made Canada like 100 years later. I guess you could say the American Revolution was actually a conservative movement to keep self-government because the colonies were already almost completely self-governing, and then the British tried to do centralization reforms and really exert their power, and this made the Americans crash out. I think there was like a guy in Massachusetts who was like, we've always ruled ourselves. We said we like swore loyalty to the King of England, but everyone knew that that's ceremonial, and we've always ruled ourselves in New England, and we're going to go back to doing that, and nothing's really going to change. So a lot of American revolutionaries saw themselves as just trying to go back to the old ways where they ruled themselves in their own little colonies and Britain really didn't have anything to do with it, but along the way they got swept up into Enlightenment era ideals of republicanism and federalism and made a country. And why did colonial America happen? I guess that's why did colonialism happen? European countries wanted resources, and a lot of it was for national pride, I guess. I'm not really sure how profitable colonial America was to the British for the 150 years or so they had the 13 colonies, but I mean, it was a pretty big export of raw materials, especially fish and lumber. The English had cut down most of their forests, and they needed lumber to build their giant navy. So it was pretty useful. Then mercantilism, they put kind of very draconian protectionist laws that the British American colonies could only trade with Britain or other British colonies, even if that was, by far, not the free market's desired solution. So, smuggling was pretty common. So I don't really know how profitable they were. A lot of colonialism was due to just pride, honestly, competing with other European countries. And I guess a lot of people wanted a fresh start, so they came to a new land to, have a new opportunity for a new life. All right, there are a lot of repeats, so as I said, I'm not going to do repeats, or even if it's not explicitly a repeat, stuff that if there's stuff that I already addressed, I'm not going to do it. Why did colonial Americans begin a movement for independence? Well, as I said last time, they had self-rule really for 100 years, and then Britain tried to centralize and exert their authority and really crack down on these colonies that were, for all intents and purposes, independent countries. I mean, the practical amount of control that the English monarchy was exerting on the 13 colonies before, the French and Indian War was very low. I mean, they tried in the 1680s, and there was some rebellions, and they basically just stayed away. It was a policy called salutary neglect, where they just basically let us do whatever we want, except for trade, which was, always a sore spot. But then they tried to centralize and control us, so they rebelled. Why did the colonial settlers come to America? Well, I said before, I guess, you want land and stuff. Why did slavery exist in colonial America? Well, the Spanish method was to enslave the natives, but when they got to America, they realized that there really weren't many natives because the diseases that had spread from Columbus's contact had, by the point of Jamestown, killed a lot of the natives, high 90s% in some areas. I mean, just complete decimation, even before the Europeans arrived. And then, the Europeans didn't have to do even that much work of genocide, as dark as it is, because so many of them had already been killed off. So, yeah, pretty dark. I mean, when they came to, Massachusetts, they just found just empty Indian villages because so many had died of the plague. So there wasn't really a native class they could enslave, so they just imported Africans starting in 1619, and they worked on plantations growing rice, indigo, cotton, and tobacco, which continued until 1865, at least officially. I mean, sharecropping is a bit sus, but legally slavery was outlawed in the U.S. in 1865, except for prisons. All right, now the final category, could women own property in colonial America? Generally, no. I'm sure there were some exceptions, but generally married women could not own property, and anything they had as single women would go to their husbands. I mean, basically, women married young back then. Basically, if you were a single woman, your assets would be controlled by your father or your male guardian, and if you were married, it would be controlled by your husband. So really, there was not that much opportunity for a woman to even be independent legally of a male figure. Could women vote in colonial America? Generally, no. In the places that had democracy, women usually could not vote. Women did not gain the national right to vote in America until 1920, although some states had it earlier, but only New Jersey had it before the 1800s, and that was due to a loophole in their constitution, which they quickly fixed once they realized that they accidentally let women vote. All right, could we survive colonial America? I don't know who we is, but if it's like modern Americans, like if you took a bunch of modern Americans and dropped them into colonial America, I'm sure we would survive. I mean, millions of people did. Couldn't be that hard. I mean, it'd be difficult adjustment, but I'm sure we'd find our way. I mean, I might do pretty well personally because of how much I know about colonial America, so I know a lot of the lore, and I have at least partial colonial British heritage, so I guess I could go to Plymouth and Plymouth Colony and find some of my ancestors, and they'd probably take me in. Could indentured servants vote in colonial America? Generally, no. In the states with indentured servitude, you had to be a free man to vote. Who could not vote in colonial America? Basically, it depends on the state, but basically anyone who is not a free, white, property-owning man of the right age. Not every state had property requirements. Most had property requirements in the form of land or some amount of money. Usually white only, usually men only, and usually free only. All right, and to end it off, why would colonial America be described as a melting pot? Well, I guess colonial America could be described as a melting pot because there were many different groups that kind of blended together. I mean, English, Germans, Dutch, all kind of formed a common culture. I mean, there were differences, but a lot of Germans actually. There was British people made fun of Americans being this like mongrel society with like Germans and English and blacks and Indians, but there was actually, it was thought that America's national language might become German because of just how many Germans were coming over. Even back then, I mean, there was a way bigger wave of Germans in the 1840s and 50s. And then finally, when did the colonies become America? I would say that the colonies did not have a necessarily unified view of themselves until the French and Indian War, the 1750s, with Benjamin Franklin's famous drawing of the snake, join or die, showing that the colonies needed to come together or get killed by the French and Indians. I mean, the colonies had wars, so they did not really see each other as a even the fact that they all swore loyalty to the same king didn't help much in the way of their conflicts with each other. But yeah, I think they really became America in the 1750s and 60s, and then of course an independent country in 1776 and modern constitution in 1789. All right, I guess that's the end of the video, so see you later.